This 4-year-old homeless girl found a man in an abandoned house she used for sleeping. He had a rope around his neck, about to do something terrible. But when she asked him to stop, something terrible happens. He puts the rope around her neck and watch until the end and discover the end of this beautiful story. Comment what was the biggest sadness of your life and subscribe to the channel to support my work. John Smith looked at the gold watch on his wrist for the last time. It was a Rolex, a gift from one of the biggest artists he'd ever managed. Now, that valuable object would be just another reminder of what he used to be. With trembling fingers, he took off the watch and placed it on the worn wooden desk, along with his empty wallet and the phone that no longer rang. The office that was once his temple of success was now empty. The walls, once decorated with gold and platinum records, displayed only lighter rectangular marks on the faded wallpaper. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of the city that continued its life, uncaring about his downfall. His hands trembled as he signed the last document. JS Entertainment, a company he built from the ground up and turned into an entertainment empire, now officially belonged to the creditors. 15 years of hard work, thousands of connections, dozens of artistic careers launched, all lost because of a single wrong decision. He had bet too high. The new studio complex would be revolutionary, the largest in North America. The projects were grandiose, the loans too. When the market crashed and the investors pulled out, it was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. The sound of Susan's heels echoed through the empty hallway, even before she appeared. John didn't need to look to know his wife was there. He could smell the expensive perfume she always wore, a fragrance that now seemed to suffocate him. "The lawyers are waiting," she said, her voice as cold as the marble floor. "The judge ruled that you have 48 hours to leave the Bel Air mansion." John finally raised his eyes. Susan was impeccable as always. The designer red dress hugged her. Curves, her dark hair perfectly styled, framed her striking face. But there was something different in her brown eyes. The sparkle of admiration she once dedicated to him was gone. "And Lily?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Can I at least say goodbye to our daughter?" Susan adjusted the designer bag on her shoulder, a gesture he knew well. It was what she did when she was about to say something particularly cruel. "Lily is with the nanny in the Hamptons. I thought it was better to spare her from seeing her father like this," she replied, her red lips curving into a joyless smile. "Besides, I need to protect our daughter. I don't want her to grow up associating her father's image with a failure." The words hit John like slaps. His own wife, the woman who promised to be by his side in joy and in sorrow, now treated him like a stranger, worse, like a shame that needed to be hidden from their 3-year-old daughter. "You can't do this," he murmured, getting up. "Lily is my daughter too." "I can and I will," Susan snapped. "My lawyers have already filed for sole custody. With your current financial situation, I doubt you can even afford a lawyer to contest it." John felt his legs weaken. He leaned on the desk to avoid falling. Was it not enough to lose everything he built? Now he would also lose the right to see his own daughter grow up. "Why are you doing this to me, Susan?" he asked, his voice cracking. 15 years together. You said you loved me." "Loved the successful man you were," she replied, turning her back. "Not this loser you've become." Before leaving, Susan stopped at the door and looked one last time at what was left of the man who was once her husband. "Oh, and one more thing," she said, her voice now loaded with cruel satisfaction. "I think you should know. Mark and I have been together for 6 months." John's world, which was already shattered, finished collapsing with that revelation. Mark was his biggest artist, the star he himself discovered and turned into a national phenomenon. A guy 15 years younger than Susan, with a promising career ahead. Exactly the kind of man she was looking for now. When the door closed behind her, John finally broke down. The tears he had held back for weeks finally came, hot and bitter, marking his face with trails of defeat. His cell phone vibrated one last time. It was a notification from the bank informing him that his account was overdrawn. In a matter of days, the man who was once one of the most powerful in the entertainment industry found himself with nowhere to go. His credit cards were blocked, his accounts emptied. The same friends who drank his champagne and partied on his yacht now didn't answer his calls. Night fell on the city, and John wandered aimlessly through the streets that once saw him as a king. He carried only a backpack with a few changes of clothes and the documents that proved he was once someone. In his pocket, a few crumpled bills, all that remained of his empire. That's when he saw the ad. An old house for sale, practically abandoned, in a remote neighborhood. The price was low enough for his last savings, perfect, he thought, for someone planning to disappear. As he walked towards the address, John mentally calculated. The money he had would be enough to buy the house, and a few weeks' worth of food. After that, he didn't plan to be here anymore to worry about it. The house was exactly as John imagined it would be inside, a perfect reflection of what his life had become. The smell of mildew permeated every room, the peeling. Walls displayed stains from leaks, and the wooden floor creaked with every step. But for his purposes, it was perfect. The previous owner, an elderly man who could barely walk, accepted the money without asking many questions. He just handed over the rusty keys and limped away, as if he also wanted to escape that place as quickly as possible. John walked through what was once the living room, his Italian shoes raising clouds of dust with every step. Old furniture covered with dusty sheets looked like silent ghosts, mute witnesses to what he planned to do. In the center of the room, a solid wooden beam ran across the ceiling, old, but still sturdy enough to support the weight of a man. His hands trembled as he untied the knot of his silk tie, his last luxury item. The piece that once symbolized power and success would now serve a very different purpose. With fingers that were once skilled at signing multi-million-dollar contracts, he began to prepare the noose. The cell phone in his pocket vibrated one last time. It was an Instagram notification. Susan had posted a photo with Mark in a luxurious restaurant. She smiled, radiant, while her ex-artist hugged her from behind. The caption was like a stab. When you find your true love, everything makes sense. John threw the device against the wall, watching it shatter just as his life had done. Tears flowed freely now. There was no more need to keep them hidden. There was no one left to impress, no one to pretend to be strong for. He climbed onto an old chair he found in the corner, testing its stability. His thoughts returned to Lily, his little princess, who would now grow up without knowing her father. Maybe it was better that way, he thought bitterly. Better for her to keep the memories of the powerful and successful father than to know the ruin he had become. The noose was already ready, hanging from the beam like a waiting snake. John adjusted it around his neck, feeling the fine fabric of the tie scratch his skin. He closed his eyes, preparing to take the final step. That's when he heard it. A laugh. Small, innocent, like chimes tinkling in the wind. So out of place, in that scene of despair that for a moment he thought he was imagining things. He opened his eyes, and his heart almost stopped. There, standing in the doorway of the room, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 4 years old. She wore a tattered dress that was once pink. Her small, dirty feet left marks on the dusty floor. Her dark hair, tangled and poorly cut, framed a face that, despite the precarious conditions, radiated genuine curiosity. "What game are you playing?" she asked, tilting her head to the side like a curious bird. John froze. His mind tried to process the absurd situation. Where had this child come from? What was she doing there? "It's not a game," he replied, his voice hoarse. "You shouldn't be here. Where are your parents?" The girl shrugged, a surprisingly adult gesture for someone so small. "I don't have parents," she replied with a devastating simplicity. "I live here." The words hit John like a punch in the stomach. He looked around, noticing for the first time small signs of a child's presence that he had ignored before. A piece of colored chalk in the corner, a battered rag doll hidden behind a box. "What do you mean you live here? Alone?" "Yes," she replied, approaching without fear. "My name is Isla Vittoria. Can I play too?" Before John could answer, she pointed to the noose around his neck. "That looks fun. Make one for me too." The world seemed to stop. There he was, a grown man, planning to give up on everything, while a child who had nothing, who lived alone in an abandoned house, faced the same situation as a game. His legs buckled. He stepped down from the chair in a jerky motion, tearing the tie from his neck as if it burned. He fell to his knees on the dusty floor, violent sobs shaking his body. Isla approached, her steps small and silent on the old floorboards. She stopped in front of him, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and concern that only a child can show. "Why are you crying?" she asked, her voice as soft as a breeze. "Did you get hurt?" John raised his face, meeting the girl's eyes that, despite all the adversities she had certainly already faced, still held a glimmer of innocence and hope. "Yes," he replied between sobs, "but not in the way you think." Isla was silent, for a moment, as if processing his words. Then she did something that John would never expect. She started to sing. It was a simple melody, probably learned somewhere he would never know. Her voice, although childish, had a unique quality, sweet and clear, like water running over stones in a stream. The music filled the dark environment, echoing through the empty walls, transforming that place of despair into something different, something alive, something with hope. And as he listened to that small but powerful voice, something began to change inside John. The darkness that consumed him began to recede like shadows fleeing the light of dawn. There he was, a man who had everything and lost everything, being comforted by a child who never had anything, but still found reasons to sing. The irony of the situation did not escape him. He had chosen that house to die, but instead, he found something much more valuable, a reason to live. The days that followed were a roller coaster of emotions for John. The discovery of Isla had completely changed his plans, but the reality of his situation was still brutal. The money was running out quickly, and now he had to think not only about himself, but also about the girl who, unintentionally, had saved his life. Gradually, he discovered more about little Isla. She had lived practically alone in that house. For months, surviving on scraps of food she found, and the occasional kindness of neighbors who barely noticed her existence. Nobody knew exactly where she had come from. Some said she was abandoned, others that she ran away from somewhere. The only certainty was that no one ever looked for her. On a particularly cold morning, John woke up to the sound of Isla coughing. She was huddled in a corner, shivering, wearing only the thin dress that was practically her only piece of clothing. His heart ached at the sight. "Come here," he called, extending his arms. The girl hesitated for a moment, a reflection of a life where affection was scarce but soon approached. John took off his own jacket and wrapped it around her, watching how the fabric swallowed her thin little body. "We need to buy you some clothes," he said, more to himself than to her. He checked the money he had left. A few crumpled bills that would barely pay for a week's worth of food, but he couldn't let her go cold. That afternoon, he did something he never imagined he would do. He went into a thrift store. He who once only wore international designer brands, now rummaged through racks of second-hand clothes, looking for something that would fit Isla. The saleswoman, An elderly lady with kind eyes watched with curiosity that man who, despite the worn expensive clothes, had clearly known better days. When Isla tried on a simple but clean and warm blue dress, her eyes shone in a way that made John's heart ache. "I've never had a new dress," she said, spinning in front of the store's broken mirror. For her, that used piece was like a treasure. On the way back home, John stopped in front of a public school. Children were playing in the yard, their laughter echoing down the street. Isla watched fascinated, clutching the bag with her new clothes against her chest. "Do you want to go to school?" he asked, watching how her eyes followed the other children. "Can I?" Her question came out in a hopeful whisper, as if she feared that just the act of wanting something could make the possibility disappear. It was at that moment that John made a decision that would change their lives forever. It wouldn't be easy. He knew that. A man without documents, without proof of residence, trying to enroll a child who technically didn't even exist in the system. But he had to try. The next morning, he put on his last clean dress shirt and went to the school. The principal, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Peterson, listened to his story with a mixture of skepticism and compassion. "Mr. Smith, you understand that without documentation, without proof of guardianship, it's practically impossible to enroll her," she explained, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. "Please," John found himself begging, something that a few months ago would have been unthinkable for him. "She needs a chance. She needs to study, to have a normal life." Mrs. Peterson looked out the window, where Ayla waited sitting on a bench, humming softly to herself. "She sings well," the principal commented, noting how even the birds seemed to stop to listen to the childish melody. "Yes, she has a gift," John replied, a flicker of his old instinct for talent emerging momentarily. After what seemed like an eternity, Mrs. Peterson sighed. "I'm going to do something I shouldn't," she said, picking up some forms. "I'll enroll her provisionally, but you need to regularize her situation. Contact Child Protective Services, file for guardianship. I can't keep a student indefinitely without documentation." That small victory was like a ray of light in the darkness. Seeing Ayla wearing the school uniform for the first time, her hair now combed and tied in 2 braids, made with the help of a neighbor, was a moment that John would cherish forever. But reality soon knocked on the door. To keep Ayla in school, he would need money for supplies, for food, for appropriate clothes. His pride, already in tatters, had to be completely set aside. He started doing odd jobs, washing cars, carrying groceries, doing small repairs. He, who once coordinated entire teams, now worked as a construction laborer. His hands, previously only accustomed to signing contracts, now knew calluses and wounds. Every morning he took Ayla to school before going to work. In the afternoon, when he picked her up, she always greeted him with a smile and a new song she had learned. Those moments made all the effort worthwhile. But not everything was smiles. At night, when Ayla slept, John faced his own demons. The memories of his previous life haunted him. The face of Lily, his biological daughter, who was now growing up without knowing him, Susan's betrayal, the loss of everything he built. In his darkest moments, he questioned whether he had the right to try to be a father again, whether he was just fooling himself. The situation became even more complicated when Child Protective Services finally began to investigate Ayla's case. A social worker, Mrs. Davis, began to make regular visits. Her expressions of disapproval at seeing the conditions of the house were evident. "Mr. Smith," she said on one of her visits, "I understand your good intentions, but you need to understand that you can't just decide to take care of a child without any formalization. There are procedures, there are rules. And what will happen to her if I can't get custody?" he asked, fearing the answer. "She will be placed in a foster home, where she can be adopted by a family with adequate conditions to raise her." replied Mrs. Davis, her tone professional but not devoid of compassion. Those words were like stabs in John's heart. A foster home? After everything Ayla had already been through, after the bond they had created, that night, as he watched Ayla sleep wrapped in her thin blanket, John made a silent promise. No matter what he had to do, he would not let them take her away from him. She had already suffered too many abandonments in her short life. The battle for Ayla's custody became an exhausting journey. Each day brought a new challenge, a new requirement, a new document that John needed to provide. The bureaucratic process seemed like an impossible mountain to climb for someone in his situation. On a particularly difficult morning, John was sitting on a hard chair in the waiting room of the courthouse, awaiting another hearing. His clothes, although clean, were visibly worn. His calloused hands held a folder with all the documents he managed to gather, proof of the odd jobs he did. Statements from neighbors, Ayla's school report card. On the other side of the room, a well-dressed couple watched him with barely disguised curiosity. The man wore a suit that probably cost more than everything John had earned in recent months. The woman carried a designer bag that he recognized. It was the type he used to give as a gift to Susan. "John Smith?" called the secretary, interrupting his thoughts. As he entered the judge's chamber, he felt his stomach churn. Judge Roberts was known for her strictness in custody cases. Her perceptive eyes behind her thin-rimmed glasses seemed to see through any attempt at dissimulation. "Mr. Smith," she began, flipping through the file, "your situation is, to say the least, peculiar. A man with no fixed address, no formal employment, trying to obtain custody of a child who technically doesn't even exist in official records." John swallowed hard. "Judge Roberts, I know my situation isn't ideal, but—" "Isn't ideal," she interrupted. "You live in a house that barely stands, do odd jobs to survive, and yet you believe you have the conditions to raise a child." The words were harsh, but true. Even so, John couldn't give up. "I understand your concerns," he said, keeping his voice steady. "But Ayla isn't just a child I found. She saved me. When I had no more reason to continue, she gave me one." The judge adjusted her glasses, her gaze softening slightly. "Continue. Before I met her, I had everything money could buy, but I lost everything. I was about to—" He hesitated. The memories of that night still painful. "I was about to give up, but Ayla appeared, and without knowing it, showed me that there was still hope. Since then, I've been fighting every day to give her the life she deserves." Judge Roberts flipped through a few more pages of the file. "I have here the school report. The girl has excelled, especially in music. The principal praises her development and adaptation." John felt a small glimmer of hope. "Yes, she has. A natural gift for music. And more than that, she has incredible inner strength. After everything she's been through, she can still smile, sing, dream." And the judge observed him for a long moment before continuing. "Mr. Smith, you know that there are families in much more stable situations interested in adoption? Families who could offer Ayla material comfort, quality education?" "I know," he replied, feeling his heart tighten. "And if I believed that would be best for her, I would step aside. But Ayla has already been through too many abandonments. She needs love, consistency, someone who understands her story and her pain. She needs someone who promises to never give up on her, no matter what happens." A heavy silence fell over the room. John could hear his own heart beating. Finally, Judge Roberts closed the file. "I'll be honest," she said. "Your situation is far from ideal. Under normal circumstances, I would never consider granting custody in conditions like yours." John felt the world collapse. But before he could protest, she continued, "However, this is not a normal case. The bond you have developed is evident, and sometimes what a child needs most is not material comfort, but true love and dedication." She paused, as if carefully weighing her next words. I will establish a probationary period. You will have 6 months to improve your conditions. I need to see concrete efforts, a more stable job, a more suitable home. During this period, Ela will remain under your temporary guardianship, with regular visits from Child Protective Services. It was more than John expected. He left the courthouse with a mixture of relief and renewed determination. He had a chance, small, difficult, but real. That afternoon, when he went to pick up Isla at school, she ran into his arms as she always did. Her uniform was a little stained with paint. There had been art class that day, and her eyes shone with excitement. "Dad!" she called, the word still new and precious to both of them. Today, the teacher let me sing in front of the whole class. Everyone applauded. John hugged her tight, feeling tears welling up in his eyes. That's wonderful, my love. You are very brave. I didn't cry or anything, she continued proudly. The teacher said I have a natural talent. Those words sparked an idea in John's mind. Maybe there was a way to turn Ayla's gift into an opportunity for both of them. That night, after she fell asleep, John took his old cell phone. Repaired precariously after the night he threw it against the wall, he began to search for music festivals, competitions, any event where a talented child could perform. He found a small festival that would take place in the neighboring neighborhood in a few weeks. The prize wasn't a big deal, but it was a start, and he, more than anyone, knew how small beginnings could lead to great achievements. We're going to make it, my little one, he whispered, watching Isla sleep peacefully. I promise. The weeks leading up to the festival were intense. John dedicated every free minute to helping Isla prepare, even without any formal knowledge of music. He watched how she sang naturally, her sweet voice filling the empty rooms of the old house with a beauty that seemed not to belong in that place. One afternoon, while working as a helper on a nearby construction site, John overheard a conversation that would change his plans. 2 construction workers were talking about a lady who gave music lessons at her home, charging very little to the neighborhood kids. Her name was Mrs. Beatrice, and she was a former conservatory professor who now retired, dedicated her time to teaching children who couldn't afford private lessons. With his heart in his throat, John knocked on the door of Mrs. Beatrice's simple but well-kept house. The lady, with her white hair tied in an elegant bun and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, greeted him with a gentle smile. I don't have much money, he explained, the shame burning his face. But my daughter, she has a gift. I need to help her develop it. Mrs. Beatrice adjusted her glasses and looked at Isla, who was partially hiding behind John's legs. Sing. Something for me, dear, she asked, sitting down at the old piano that occupied a good part of her small living room. Isla, normally so outgoing when it came to music, hesitated. John knelt beside her, whispering words of encouragement. Finally, she began to sing, the same simple melody she had sung that fateful night when she met John. Mrs. Beatrice's eyes widened slightly. Without saying anything, she began to play a few notes on the piano, and Isla instinctively followed the melody. It was as if her voice and the instrument conversed, danced together in perfect harmony. When the music ended, a reverent silence hung in the room. Mrs. Beatrice turned to John, her eyes shining in a way he didn't expect. I won't charge anything, she said firmly. A talent like that cannot be wasted. But I have 2 conditions. She needs to come 3 times a week without fail, and you need to promise me that you will always support her no matter what happens. John felt tears welling up in his eyes. I promise, he replied, his voice choked with emotion. I'll do anything for her. The lessons with Mrs. Beatrice transformed Ayla. Not only did her technique improve rapidly, but her confidence grew. The shy girl who hid behind her father's legs now sang with a stage presence surprising for her age. The festival was approaching, and with it grew John's anxiety. He had used the little money he managed to save to buy a new dress for Isla. Nothing too expensive, but clean and pretty. Mrs. Beatrice had chosen a perfect song for her voice, something that would highlight her natural talent. The night before the performance, while arranging Ayla's hair for sleep, now more skilled in the braids she loved so much, she asked a question that caught him by surprise. "Dad," she began, her small voice reflecting a worry that shouldn't exist in someone so young. "What if I don't win tomorrow? Will you be sad with me?" John stopped what he was doing, turning her so he could look into her eyes. "Isla, listen carefully to what I'm going to tell you. No matter what happens tomorrow, you are already a winner. You know why?" She shook her head, curious. "Because you never gave up. Even when life was hard, even when you were alone, you kept singing, you kept dreaming. That's worth more than any prize." Isla hugged him tight, and John felt her small heart beating against his chest. How was it possible to love someone so much in so little time? The day of the festival dawned sunny. The event took place in a neighborhood square, with a small makeshift stage and a few rows of plastic chairs. It was nothing compared to the big shows John had produced, but somehow it seemed even more important. Mrs. Beatrice was there, sitting in the front row, her hands clasped in her lap in a gesture of contained anxiety. Beside her, some other children from the neighborhood, who were also her students, awaited their turn to perform. When they called Ayla's name, John felt his heart stop. She went up on stage in her new dress, her hair arranged in two perfect braids, looking even smaller under the makeshift lights. The silence that followed was absolute, and then she began to sing. It was as if the whole world stopped to listen. Her voice, pure and crystalline, rose in the afternoon air, telling a story of hope and overcoming through the melody. People passing by the square stopped, captured by the magic of that moment. When the last note dissipated in the air, there was a moment of stunned silence before the audience exploded in applause. John saw tears in Mrs. Beatrice's eyes, saw emotional smiles on the faces of strangers, but nothing compared to Isla's smile when she came down from the stage and ran into his arms. At that moment, he knew that was just the beginning. It was. No surprise when they announced the result. Isla had won. The prize wasn't big, just a simple trophy and a gift certificate to a local music store, but the real prize was what happened next. A man approached them, introducing himself as a cultural event organizer from the area. He had filmed Isla's performance and posted it on his social media. The video was already starting to go viral. "She has something special," he said, handing his card to John. "I would like to invite her to perform at other events, small ones for now, but who knows where this could lead." John took the card with trembling hands, memories of his previous life as an entertainment manager flooding his mind. But this time, it was different. It wasn't about money or power. It was about giving Isla the chance to shine, to develop her gift. That night, as he watched his little star sleep, embracing the trophy that was bigger than her, John made new, silent promises. This time, he would do things right. He wouldn't let success go to his head. He wouldn't lose sight of what really mattered. What he didn't know was that fate had other plans. The video of Isla singing continued to spread across the internet, reaching people he didn't expect. Soon, his past and his present would collide in a way he could never predict. The video of Isla's performance spread like wildfire across social media. In a few days, it reached thousands of views. People shared, commented, asked who that little girl with an angel's voice was. What started as a simple performance at a neighborhood festival was turning into a viral phenomenon. John watched everything with a mixture of pride and apprehension. His previous experience in the art world made him understand better than anyone how fame could be a double-edged sword. Each new invitation to perform, each message from admirers, each proposal from managers was carefully analyzed. One Saturday morning, while preparing the simple breakfast he could afford to offer Ayla, his cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Mr. Smith?" The voice on the other end was professional, polite. "This is from the production team of America's Got Talent. We saw your daughter's video and would like to invite her for a special performance next Sunday." John's heart jumped. America's Got Talent was one of the highest-rated shows on network television. A performance there could catapult any artist's career. "It's a unique opportunity," the producer continued. "All costs will be covered by the show, transportation, accommodation, wardrobe. We would just like Ayla to sing the same song from the video that went viral." John looked at Ayla, who was playing distractedly with her oatmeal, humming softly as she always did. She seemed so small, so innocent. Would she be ready for something so big? "Can I give you an answer by tomorrow?" he asked. "I need to talk to her first." That night, after dinner, John sat with Ayla on the small sofa in the living room. He explained about the invitation, about the show, trying to use words she could understand. "There will be a lot of people watching, many more than at the festival," he explained, "and you won't just be singing for people in the neighborhood, but for the whole country. How do you feel about that?" Ayla was silent for a moment, her small fingers playing with the hem of her dress. "Will I get to wear a pretty dress?" she asked finally. John smiled. "Yes, the show will give you a special dress. And will you be there with me?" "Of course, my love. Always." She smiled, that smile that illuminated the whole room. "Then I want to sing." The following Monday, John called to confirm the participation. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparations. Mrs. Beatrice intensified the lessons, working not only on vocal technique, but also helping Ayla to deal with nervousness. "When you're there," the teacher explained gently, "imagine that you're singing just for your dad, like you do here at home." The big day arrived faster than they expected. A car from the show picked them up early, taking them to the studios of the network. Ayla was amazed by everything. The lights, the cameras, the dressing rooms full of mirrors. The show's costume. Designer brought several dress options. Ayla tried each one on, with the enthusiasm of a child who never had many pretty clothes. Finally, they chose a light blue dress, with small embroidered flowers and a satin ribbon at the waist. While a professional makeup artist did a soft makeover on Ayla's face, appropriate for her age, John watched everything with a lump in his throat. He remembered how many times he'd been on the other side, as a manager handling artists on shows like that. Now he was there as a father, his hands sweating with nerves, his heart beating fast. That's when he heard a voice that made his blood run cold. Well, what a pleasant coincidence. John turned around slowly. There, standing in the doorway of the dressing room, was Mark, his former artist, the man Susan chose, now one of the biggest stars in the country. He smiled, but his eyes had a calculating glint that John knew well. "So you're the one behind the little internet sensation?" Mark continued, entering the dressing room as if he owned the place. "What goes around comes around, doesn't it, John?" Ayla, sensing the tension in the air, stopped humming and looked worriedly at her father. Mark approached her, still smiling. "Hello, Princess. I'm Mark. I'll be performing on the show too today." John stepped forward, placing himself between Mark and Ayla. "What do you want?" "Relax, John," Mark replied, raising his hands in a gesture of false peace. "Just came to say hello. Besides, there's someone else who will be very interested too. Know about this new discovery of yours." Before John could respond, a production assistant rushed into the dressing room. 5 minutes to Ayla's performance. John's heart was racing, but he needed to control himself. He couldn't let Ayla notice his nervousness. He knelt in front of her, adjusting the ribbon on her dress. "Remember what Mrs. Beatrice said?" he asked softly. Ayla nodded. Imagine I'm singing just for you. That's right. You're going to knock 'em dead, my love. When Isla stepped onto the stage, under the bright lights of the studio, John held his breath. The host gave a warm introduction, briefly telling the story of the viral video, and then she began to sing. It was magical. Her voice, even more beautiful with Mrs. Beatrice's work, filled the studio. The audience, which moments before was talking and moving, became completely silent. The cameras captured every expression, every perfect note. John watched from backstage, tears running freely down his face. On the monitor next to him, he could see the close-ups the director made of Isla's face, of her closed eyes as she surrendered to the music. When she finished, the studio exploded in applause. The host ran to hug her, clearly moved. The audience was on its feet. But John barely had time to savor that moment of triumph. His cell phone vibrated in his pocket, a message from a number he hadn't deleted, even after so much time. It was from Susan. "We need to talk about your new protégé. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., at the coffee shop near the studio. Don't be late." The icy fear that settled in his chest wasn't for him. It was for Isla. He knew better than anyone what Susan was capable of when she wanted something. The coffee shop was practically empty when John arrived. He chose a table, in the corner, from where he could see the door. His hands trembled slightly as he held the cup of cheap coffee. It was all he could afford, and even that weighed on his tight budget. Isla had stayed with Mrs. Beatrice, who readily offered to take care of her during that meeting. The music teacher had become more than a mentor. She was practically a grandmother to the girl. Exactly at 10 o'clock, Susan entered the establishment. Even after so much time, her presence still made an impact. She wore an impeccable tailored suit, high heels that echoed on the floor, discreet but visibly expensive jewelry. Her familiar perfume filled the room when she sat down across from John. "You look terrible," were her first words, observing the worn clothes of her ex-husband. "What do you want, Susan?" John asked, getting straight to the point. He didn't want to prolong that meeting more than necessary. She opened her designer bag, taking out a latest model tablet. With a few taps, she showed the viral video of Isla and her performance on the television show. "Impressive," she commented, her voice calculatedly neutral. "The girl has a natural talent. With the right training, the right connections, a professional team, she could go far." John felt his stomach churn. He knew that tone. It was the same one she used when she was planning something. "Isla is not for sale, Susan." "Don't be dramatic, John," she replied, rolling her eyes. "No one is talking about selling anything. I'm offering an opportunity. You, more than anyone, should know the value of that." She paused, taking a sip of the gourmet coffee she had ordered before continuing. "Mark and I are launching a new record label. We want to focus on young talent, something more familiar. Isla would be perfect as our first artist." "No," John replied immediately. "She's just a child. A child you put on television to sing," Susan retorted. "Don't be a hypocrite. The difference is that with us, she would have structure, protection, a guaranteed future." John felt the anger grow in his chest. "Protection, like the one you offered our daughter when you prevented me from seeing her." Susan's face hardened. "Don't you dare compare the situations. Lily is doing great, attends the best schools, has everything she needs. What can you offer Isla? A house falling apart, thrift store clothes." "I can offer love," he replied, his voice firm. "I can offer a home where she is loved for who she is, not for what she can produce." Susan laughed, a cold and humorless sound. "Love doesn't pay the bills, John. It doesn't buy opportunities. You used to be smarter than that." She took an envelope from her bag, sliding it across the table. "Here's our proposal. It's an exclusive contract. We would take care of everything. Housing, education, career. You could continue being the father, supervised, of course." "Supervised?" The word came out like a growl. "Naturally, we can't risk her image with a father." Well, in your current conditions. John picked up the envelope, but instead of opening it, he tore it to shreds. No. Susan's smile disappeared. You're not in a position to refuse, John. Your situation with her custody is precarious, to say the least. A judge would be very interested to know how a child without documents ended up in your care. Are you threatening me? I'm being realistic. What do you think will happen when they find out about your past? A bankrupt ex-manager who lost everything, living in questionable conditions with a minor. Doesn't look very suitable, does it? John felt his blood run cold. He knew she had power, connections. She could really make his life hell if she wanted to. Think about it, she continued, getting up. You have 48 hours to reconsider. After that, well, I can't promise that the authorities won't be informed about certain irregularities. She threw a few bills on the table, more than enough to pay for both coffees. It's for the taxi, she said with a cruel smile. I know you're saving money. When Susan left, John remained seated, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. His cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Mrs. Beatrice with a photo of Isla. The girl smiled, sitting at the piano, clearly happy. The image made his heart ache. He couldn't lose her. He couldn't let Susan turn something so pure into another of her calculated projects. But how to fight against someone with so much power? How to protect Isla when he could barely protect himself? That night, after picking up Isla, John watched her sleep. She still hummed in her dreams, a habit he found adorable. Her little face was serene, without any sign of the worries that now tormented her father. The cell phone vibrated again. Another message from Susan. 42 hours, John. Time is running out. He turned off the device, not wanting to see any more threats. He needed to think. He needed a plan. That's when he remembered something he had kept in the back of a drawer, a business card from someone who maybe, just maybe, could help. It was a lawyer he met in his glory days, someone who always seemed different from the others, more interested in justice than in money. His hands trembled as he dialed the number. It was past midnight, but to his surprise, the call was answered. Dr. Miller, this is John Smith. I know it's been a long time, but I need your help. The voice on the other end of the line was gentle, without any trace of the contempt that John had become accustomed to receiving since his downfall. John, I was actually following your story. Saw your girl on television yesterday. Impressive. Doctor, I'm in trouble. Serious trouble. There was a pause on the other end. Come to my office tomorrow, first thing in the morning. Let's talk. John hung up the phone, feeling a small flame of hope. He went back to watching Isla, who stirred, in her sleep, hugging her pillow tighter. It's going to be all right, my love, he whispered, more to himself than to her. I promise. What he didn't know was that Susan was also making her own calls that night, and that the battle that was about to begin would be much bigger than he imagined. Dr. Miller's office was very different from what John remembered. There was no longer the sumptuousness of before, the expensive furniture, the works of art on the walls. It was a simple place, although organized, in a modest commercial building in downtown. I also lost a lot in recent years, the lawyer explained, noticing John's gaze. But unlike others, it wasn't due to mismanagement. I chose to follow a different path, to defend causes I truly believe in. John sat in the simple chair in front of the desk, Isla by his side. He had no one to leave her with that morning. Mrs. Beatrice had appointments, and he didn't trust anyone else. Dr. Miller smiled gently at the girl. You must be Ayla. I saw your performance on television. It was very beautiful. She smiled shyly, moving closer to John. The lawyer then turned his attention to the papers John had brought, all the documents related to the temporary guardianship, Susan's threats, the torn contract from the record label. Complicated situation, he murmured, adjusting his glasses. Your ex-wife has powerful connections, influence, and unfortunately, on paper, she has arguments that a more conservative judge could consider valid. John felt his heart tighten. I can't lose her, doctor. I can't let them turn her into a money-making machine. Dr. Miller raised his eyes from the documents, his gaze penetrating. You know why I quit corporate law, John? Because I got tired of seeing people like your ex-wife always winning. I got tired of seeing money deciding what's right and wrong. He stood up, walking to the window. But sometimes, very rarely, we have the chance to fight the right battle. And when I see you two together, the way she leans on you, how your eyes constantly follow her, worried, I know this is one of those battles. But how? John asked, his voice choked with emotion. I don't have money for a long trial. I don't have... Money is not a problem, Dr. Miller interrupted. I'll take your case pro bono. But I need you to trust me and follow exactly what I'm going to say. The lawyer sat down again, now with a determined expression. First, we need to regularize Isla's situation. That means finding any documentation about her past, her origin. Without that, Susan can use the irregularity of the situation against you. But we don't know anything about her past, John replied, desperate. Everyone has a past, John. We just need to look in the right places. Dr. Miller took a notepad and began to make a list. I'll activate some contacts. Hospitals, shelters, vital records. Someone, somewhere, must have information about her. Meanwhile, you need to strengthen your position. How? Get a steady job. It doesn't have to be anything grand, but something with a paycheck, stable. Improve the conditions of the house a little. It doesn't have to be luxurious, but it needs to be safe and clean. And more importantly, document everything. Everything? Everything. Every performance of hers, every lesson with Mrs. Beatrice, every moment of daily life. We need to prove that despite the material difficulties, you offer something that Susan and her record label could never offer. A healthy family environment, true love, a normal childhood. Isla, who had remained quiet until then, pulled on. The sleeve of John's worn jacket. Dad, I'm hungry. Dr. Miller smiled, opening a drawer in his desk. He took out a package of cookies. I have a granddaughter about your age, he explained, offering the cookies. I always keep some around here. Why don't you go to that little table over there and have a snack while I talk to your dad? When Ayla walked away, happy with her snack, the lawyer lowered his voice. John, I need you to understand one thing. This battle is going to be difficult. Susan is going to play dirty. She will try to provoke you, destabilize you. Don't fall into her trap. What do you mean? She will try to make you look unstable, dangerous. She will use your past, your downfall against you. No matter what she does or says, keep calm. Every reaction of yours will be used against you in a courtroom. John nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Dr. Miller continued, and there's one more thing. Mark. What about him? He is the key to understanding Susan's true motives. It's no coincidence that they're launching a record label now, right after Ayla's viral success. They saw an opportunity for profit, yes, but there's more to it than that. How so? Think, John, you were the biggest manager in the business. You knew everyone, you had the best connections. When you fell, a lot of people profited from it. And now that you found a new talent, a genuine talent, they're afraid I'll come back, John completed, the understanding hitting him like a lightning bolt. Exactly. It's not just about Isla. It's about preventing your return to the market, and they will use all the resources they have to do that. At that moment, Ayla returned, crumbs of cookie on her simple dress. The man out there said it's time for another client. Dr. Miller nodded, standing up. I'll prepare some documents. Meanwhile, follow what we agreed. And John, yes? Don't give up. I've seen a lot in my career, and I can tell you one thing. True love, The one you feel for her is stronger than any influence or money. Leaving the office, John held Isla's hand tight. He had a lot to do, a lot to organize, but for the first time since Susan's threat, he felt like he had a chance. On the way home, they passed a small hardware store. John stopped, looking at the display window. With the little money he had saved for emergencies, maybe he could start improving the house, one room at a time. "Let's make your room beautiful," he said to Ayla. "What color do you want the walls?" Her eyes sparkled. "Can it be blue, like the sky?" "It can be any color you want, my love." What John didn't know was that, at that very moment, Susan was in a meeting with her own lawyers, and the plan she was hatching was much crueler than he could imagine. The following weeks were intense for John and Ayla. Following Dr. Miller's advice, he started working as an assistant at a small local music store. The salary was minimal, but it was a formal job with a paycheck, something that could strengthen his position in court. The owner of the store, Mr. Henderson, was a friendly man who quickly became enchanted with Ayla. In the afternoons after school, while John organized the stock, she would sit on a stool in the corner of the store, humming softly while doing her homework. "That girl has a gift," Mr. Henderson commented one day, watching how customers stopped to listen when she sang. "But more importantly than that, she has you." The house was also beginning to show small changes. On the weekends, John dedicated every free moment to making repairs. He painted Ayla's room a soft blue, fixed the leaks in the ceiling, sanded and varnished the old floor. It wasn't luxurious, but it was becoming a real home. Mrs. Beatrice continued with the music lessons, adamantly refusing to accept any payment. "My reward is seeing her talent blossom," she would say whenever John tried to insist. It was on one of those lesson afternoons that something unexpected happened. Ayla was at the piano with Mrs. Beatrice when the doorbell rang. John opened the door, and his heart almost stopped. It was Mrs. Davis, the social worker. "Surprise visit," she said, entering with her inseparable clipboard. "We need to check how things are going." John felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that visit was no coincidence. Susan had probably contacted Child Protective Services again. Mrs. Davis toured the house, making notes. Her eyes registered every detail: the freshly painted walls, the simple but clean furniture, the small bookshelf with children's books that John had gotten at a used bookstore. When they arrived at the room where Ayla had lessons, Mrs. Beatrice interrupted the lesson. The social worker watched the scene with interest. "Are you a private teacher?" she asked. "Yes," Mrs. Beatrice replied with dignity. "I have been teaching music for over 40 years. Ayla is one of my most dedicated students." "And how much do you pay for these lessons?" The question was directed at John, her tone making clear the intention to catch him in some contradiction. Before he could answer, Mrs. Beatrice stood up from the piano. "I don't charge anything," she said firmly. "I'm retired. I have my livelihood guaranteed. I do this because I recognize a special gift when I see one." Mrs. Davis made some more notes, her face revealing nothing. Finally, she sat down in the small living room with John. "Mr. Smith, I'll be frank," she began. "We have received some concerning reports, allegations that you would be exploiting Ayla's talent for financial gain, that the housing conditions would be inadequate." "That's not true," John protested. "Yes, she has made some performances, but always with accompaniment, always respecting her school and rest hours. And the house." "I'm seeing the improvements," Mrs. Davis interrupted. "It's evident that there is an effort to create a suitable environment. But you need to understand that our concern is with her well-being." At that moment, Ayla's voice filled the house. She had returned to the piano and was now singing, not a rehearsed song, but something that seemed to come straight from her soul. The lyrics, simple and touching, spoke about a father and a daughter, about love and protection. Mrs. Davis was silent, listening. When the music ended, there was something different in her eyes. "That song," she began. "She composed it herself," John explained, his voice choked with emotion. "It was her gift for my birthday last week." The social worker looked at her notes, then in the direction from where Isla's voice came, now again concentrated on her exercises with Mrs. Beatrice. "Mr. Smith," she said finally, "I'm going to be very clear. Your situation is still not ideal, but—" She paused, choosing her words. "But there's something here that can't be measured in reports or evaluated in technical visits. There's true love, there's dedication, there's a bond that would be cruel to break." John felt his heart race. Could it be that someone was finally seeing beyond appearances? "I'm going to make a report favorable to maintaining temporary guardianship," she continued. "But you need to continue improving the conditions. You need to maintain regularity at work. You need to—" She was interrupted by a noise at the door. Someone was banging hard, almost knocking down the old wood. When John opened it, his blood ran cold. It was Mark, accompanied by two men in suits that he recognized as Susan's lawyers. "We've come to get Ayla," Mark announced with a cruel smile. "We have a court order." One of the lawyers extended a paper. It was a temporary injunction, signed by a judge, ordering the immediate transfer of Ayla's custody to a temporary shelter until her situation was regularized. "No," John murmured, feeling his legs weaken. Mrs. Davis stood up, taking the document. Her eyes ran across the lines, her expression becoming increasingly serious. "This isn't right," she said. "I'm here on official visit. There's no reason for such a drastic measure." "The order is clear," one of the lawyers cut in. "If you try to stop us, we'll have to call the police." The sound of the discussion attracted Ayla and Mrs. Beatrice. When the girl saw the men in suits, she instinctively ran to John, clinging to his legs. "Dad, what's happening?" John knelt down, hugging her tight. His heart was broken, but he needed to be strong for her. "It's going to be all right, my love," he whispered, although he didn't know if he would be able to fulfill that promise. "It's going to be all right." The hours that followed were a nightmare for John. The sound of Isla's screams as the lawyers took her away echoed in his mind like endless torture. Mrs. Beatrice had fainted during the confusion and needed to be attended to by neighbors. Mrs. Davis, the social worker, was making frantic calls, trying to understand how such a drastic court order had been issued without her knowledge. "This isn't right," she repeated, her voice trembling with indignation. There were procedures underway, visits scheduled. There was no reason for such an extreme measure. John was sitting on the small sofa in the living room, staring at the piano where, minutes before, Ayla practiced her lessons. The silence of the house was now deafening. On the coffee table, the glass of water she had left half-finished, her small fingerprint still visible on the glass. Dr. Miller arrived like a hurricane, carrying a briefcase full of documents. His eyes revealed that he had understood the gravity of the situation as soon as John called. "I got a copy of the court order," he said, spreading papers on the table. "As I suspected, it was issued by Judge Thompson." "And that means?" John asked, his voice hoarse from crying. "It means that Susan used her connections. Thompson is known for favoring wealthy families in custody cases, and more than that, he has ties to the record label she and Mark are setting up." Mrs. Davis, who was still in the house, approached with interest. "That's a clear conflict of interest. I can testify that there was no situation of risk that justified such an urgent measure." "But how are we going to prove that?" questioned John, running his hands through his hair in despair. "They have power, they have money, they have greed," Dr. Miller interrupted, "and that may be our trump card." The lawyer picked up his phone, making a quick call. "Carlos, it's Miller. Remember that favor you owe me? I need a copy of all transactions involving Susan Bomfim's new record label." Yes, everything, especially anything related to Judge Thompson. While they waited, John couldn't stop pacing the house. Every corner had a memory of Isla. Her drawings on the refrigerator, her clothes folded carefully in the room, her school, supplies still on the table. Where did they take her? He asked for the 10th time. To the Santa Clara shelter, Mrs. Davis replied. It's a reputable institution, but it's not a place for her. Not when she has a father who loves her so much. The hours dragged on. Dr. Miller received constant messages on his cell phone, consulted documents, made more calls. His face was getting more and more tense. "John," he called finally, "we need to talk." The tone of his voice made John freeze. "I found out why they acted so hastily. Laiz and Mark's record label is on the verge of bankruptcy before it even starts. They invested millions in infrastructure, hired staff, but they don't have any big-name artists on the roster. They desperately needed a guaranteed hit. And they saw that in Ayla," John completed, the understanding hitting him like a punch. "Exactly. Her viral video, the TV performance, they saw a golden opportunity. A child prodigy with a touching story of overcoming adversity. It would be the perfect launch for the record label. But why not wait? Why act like this so brutally?" Dr. Miller sighed. "Because they're running out of time. The investors are pressuring them. They want results. And more than that, I found out that Mark made some risky bets in the financial market. He's practically bankrupt, totally dependent on the success of this project." John felt a bitter laugh rise in his throat. History was repeating itself, only this time it was Mark who had bet too high. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice loaded with contained anger. "They're going to use my daughter to save their skins." "Not if I can help it," Dr. Miller replied. "But we need to act fast. I have a hearing scheduled for tomorrow with another judge, one who doesn't have connections with them. We're going to expose everything, the manipulations, the conflicts of interest, the true motivation behind this court order." At that moment, Mrs. Davis's phone rang. Her expression changed completely as she answered. "What do you mean?" she asked, her face paling. "But that's irregular. They can't—" When she hung up, her hands were shaking. "Susan and Mark just arrived at the shelter," she said, "with authorization to take Isla for medical exams. But the address, it's for the record label's studios." John felt his blood boil. "They're going to try to force her to record something. They're going to use it as propaganda, as—" "They're not going to," Dr. Miller cut in, grabbing his things. "Mrs. Davis, you're coming with me. I need your official testimony. John, you stay here." "What? I can't just stand by while—" "Yes, you can, and you will." The lawyer's voice was firm. "If you show up there, that's exactly what they want. They'll provoke a scene. They'll make you look out of control. We can't give them that ammunition." John knew he was right, but the idea of staying there waiting was torture. "Promise you'll bring her back," he asked, his voice choked with emotion. "I'll do everything in my power," Dr. Miller replied. "And John, prepare yourself. This may get ugly before it gets better." After they left, John was alone with his thoughts and his fears. The house never seemed so empty, so silent. He sat at the piano where Isla used to practice, his fingers lightly touching the keys. That's when he noticed something. A small piece of folded paper hidden between the sheet music. It was a drawing by Isla, made that same morning. It showed her and John holding hands, smiling. On top, in her childish handwriting, was written, "Best dad in the world." The tears he had held back all day finally came. But along with them came a fierce determination. No matter what it cost, he wouldn't let them turn his daughter's pure gift into a commodity. He wouldn't allow her voice, which once saved him from the darkness, to be used to save the bankrupt empire of unscrupulous people. His phone vibrated, a message from Dr. Miller. "We're arriving at the studios. Isla is there. And John, you need to see this." The record label's studio occupied an entire floor of a modern commercial building. Through the mirrored glass windows, Dr. Miller and Mrs. Davis could see the intense movement inside. Security guards stood at the entrance, clearly instructed not to let anyone pass. "How are we going to get in?" asked Mrs. Davis, nervously adjusting her child protective services. "Badge. Through the front door," Dr. Miller replied, taking a document from his briefcase. "With this." It was a court order for immediate access, signed by the judge he had contacted earlier. The security guards tried to argue, but the threat of arrest for contempt made them back down. What they found inside the studio made their blood boil. Ayla was in a recording room, surrounded by producers and technicians. Susan supervised everything through the glass of the control room, while Mark gestured, trying to get the girl to sing something she clearly didn't want to. "Come on, honey." His voice sounded irritated through the microphone. "Just sing like we agreed. It's not difficult." Ayla was visibly exhausted and scared. Her red eyes showed she had cried a lot, and her small hands trembled as she held the lyrics of the song they wanted her to sing. "I want my dad." Her voice came out weak, breaking the hearts of those who heard. "Your dad can't take care of you anymore," Susan replied, her voice falsely sweet. "We're going to take care of you now. We're going to make you a star." "I don't want to be a star," Ayla shouted suddenly, throwing the sheets on the floor. "I want my dad. I want to go home." Mark made a move to enter the recording room, his face contorted with anger, but stopped when he saw Dr. Miller and Mrs. Davis. "What are you doing here?" Susan asked, standing up from her chair. "This is private property." "And this," Dr. Miller replied, raising an envelope, "is an official investigation into child abuse and commercial exploitation of a minor." The word abuse made everyone in the room freeze. The recording technicians began to look at each other, nervous. "Don't be ridiculous," Mark said, trying to maintain composure. "We're just doing a voice test. We have a court order." "Authorization for medical exams," Mrs. Davis corrected, her voice loaded with professional indignation. "Not for a commercial. Recording session." At that moment, the studio door opened, and Ayla ran out, throwing herself into Mrs. Davis's arms. The social worker hugged her protectively, noting how the girl was trembling. "This is absurd," Susan protested. "We have a contract, we have plans." "The only contract that matters," Dr. Miller interrupted, "is this one here." He took another document from his briefcase. An injunction immediately suspending the previous order from Judge Thompson, based on evidence of conflict of interest and judicial manipulation. Mark paled visibly. "You can't." "I can and I will," Dr. Miller cut in. "And there's more. I just received this." He showed his cell phone, where an email had just arrived. "These are bank records showing suspicious transfers between your record label and an offshore company linked to Judge Thompson. Do you really want to continue with this charade?" The silence that followed was deafening. The technicians began discreetly to withdraw from the room, not wanting to be involved in what was clearly becoming a scandal. "This isn't over," Susan threatened, but her voice no longer had the same confidence. "No, it isn't," Dr. Miller agreed, "because early tomorrow morning I'll be filing a lawsuit for emotional distress, attempted exploitation of a minor, and judicial malfeasance. And believe me, I have much more evidence than I've shown here." He turned to Mrs. Davis. "Can you take Ayla back to the shelter? In a few hours, we'll have the definitive order to return custody to John." But before they could leave, Mark made one last desperate move. "Wait," he shouted. What if we make a deal?" Dr. Miller stopped, turning around slowly. "What kind of deal?" "We need Ayla," Mark admitted, his arrogance finally breaking. "The record label is on the verge of bankruptcy. Without a successful artist, we're going to lose everything. We can make a partnership. John can participate. He can manage her career, have a percentage." "No." The voice came from the door. Everyone turned around, surprised. It was John. He was standing there, still wearing his simple work clothes, but there was something different in his posture, a dignity, a strength that didn't come from money or power, but from something much deeper. "Dad!" Isla shouted, running into his arms. John picked her up, hugging her tight against his chest. Then, still holding his daughter, he faced Mark and Susan. "You still don't understand, do you?" he said, his voice calm but firm. This was never about money. It was never about success or fame. He kissed Isla's forehead, who had snuggled, into his neck, finally feeling safe. "When I had everything, I lost my humanity. When I lost everything, I found something much more valuable, the true love of a daughter. And that," he looked directly at Susan, "is something you will never understand." "You're throwing away a unique opportunity," Mark argued, desperate. "She could be a star." "She already is a star," John replied. "She's the star that illuminates my life, and that's more than enough." Turning to leave, he stopped one last time. "Dr. Miller, file all the lawsuits, not for revenge, but so that they can never do this to another child." As father and daughter left the studio, the sun was setting, painting the sky with orange tones. In Dr. Miller's car, which would take them home, Isla was already asleep, exhausted from crying so much. "You know," the lawyer said, looking in the rearview mirror, "in all my years of profession, I have never seen such a complete transformation in someone." "How so?" "The John I knew years ago would never refuse money and fame. Power was everything to him, but now—" John looked at his sleeping daughter, a small smile on her lips. "Now I know what really matters," he replied simply. But the battle was not over yet. As they drove home, Susan was making one last call, one that would change everything again. The next morning, John woke up to the sound he had missed the most. Sheila humming in the kitchen while having breakfast. The normality of that moment seemed almost surreal after everything they had been through. But the peace would be short-lived. When he opened the door to get the newspaper, he found a court summons. His heart froze as he read the contents. It wasn't possible that Susan had gone this far. "What is it, Dad?" Isla asked, noticing his expression. "Nothing, my love," he lied, hiding the document. "Finish your breakfast so you won't be late for school." As soon as he dropped Ayla off at school, he rushed to Dr. Miller's office. The lawyer was already waiting for him, his face grave. "So you already know," he said upon seeing John enter. "How can she be so cruel?" John asked, throwing the summons on the table. "To use Lily like this." Susan's last card was lower than anyone could imagine. She had filed a request for total revocation of John's parental rights, not only in relation to Ayla, but also to Lily. The argument was that he represented a risk to any child in his care. "She's using Ayla's case against you," Dr. Miller explained, "alleging that you kidnapped a minor, kept her in precarious conditions, and tried to exploit her commercially. But that's ridiculous. She's the one who tried to exploit Ayla." "I know, but Susan has an advantage. She can pay the best lawyers, manipulate evidence, create a narrative that favors her." John sank into a chair, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. "What can we do?" Dr. Miller began to walk around the room, thoughtful. "We need something definitive, something she can't contest. John, we need to find Ayla's origin." "But how? We've already looked everywhere." "Not everywhere," the lawyer replied, picking up his phone. "Remember the house where you found Ayla? The former owner must know something." After a few calls and searches, they managed to locate the man who had sold the house to John. He was now living in a nursing home on the outskirts of the city. Mr. Anderson, as he was called, was sitting in a wheelchair in the nursing home's garden when they arrived. His eyes, although tired from age, gleamed with recognition upon seeing John. "Ah, the man from the old house," he said. "How is the girl?" John felt his heart leap. "Did you know Ayla?" "Ayla? No. The girl I knew was named Mary, daughter of Connie, who worked for me as a maid for years." Dr. Miller leaned in, interested. And what happened to them? Mr. Anderson sighed, his gaze lost in distant memories. Connie was a good woman, but she had problems. When she found out she was sick, she asked me to take care of the girl, but I was already old, I couldn't. Then she disappeared one night, taking her daughter. And then? Dr. Miller pressed gently. Months later, I learned that Connie had died in the public hospital. The girl, well, she must have returned to the house. It was the only place she knew. John felt his heart ache. So that was it. Ayla, or Mary, as she was originally called, had returned to the only place she considered home. Do you have any documents? Something that proves this story? Mr. Anderson pointed to a cabinet in the corner of his room. There. Should be something there. Connie left me some papers before she left. In a folder yellowed by time, they found what they were looking for. The original birth certificate of Mary Smith, born in the public hospital, daughter of Connie Smith. There was also a death certificate, confirming the mother's death from a terminal illness. This changes everything, Dr. Miller said, examining the documents. Now we can prove her origin. We can regularize her situation. But there was more. Among the papers, they found a letter written by Connie shortly before she died. It was addressed to her daughter. My little Mary, if you are reading this, it is because I could not stay with you as I wanted. But know that you were the greatest joy of my life. Your gift for music, your sweet voice that comforted me on difficult nights. That is a gift from God. Use it wisely, my daughter. And when you find someone who loves you as I loved you, hold onto that love. It will be your true family. John couldn't contain the tears as he read. Everything made sense now. Why Ayla was alone in that house, why she had that extraordinary musical gift, why fate had united them that fateful night. We need to tell her, he said. She deserves to know her story. Dr. Miller nodded. Yes, but carefully, and John, this also means that we can file for formal adoption now. On the way back, John thought about how to tell everything to Ayla. How to explain that she had a mother who loved her so much that she preferred to let her go than see her suffer. How to make a child understand that sometimes love means letting go. But before they could get home, his phone rang. It was Mrs. Beatrice, her voice trembling with worry. John, come quickly. Susan is here. She brought Lily. John sped to Mrs. Beatrice's house as fast as he could, his heart pounding in his chest. Dr. Miller was beside him, making frantic calls to block any further legal maneuvers by Susan. When they arrived, they found a scene that stopped John in his tracks. In Mrs. Beatrice's modest living room, Ayla and Lily were sitting side by side at the piano. His biological daughter, whom he hadn't seen in so long, was taller, her dark hair like her mother's, styled in an elaborate braid. Beside her, Ayla was pointing out some notes on the piano, her small hands gently guiding Lily's. Susan stood, observing the scene with an enigmatic expression. When she saw John enter, a calculated smile appeared on her lips. Isn't this a touching scene, she said. Your two daughters, finally meeting. John took a step forward, but Dr. Miller held him by the arm, whispering, Stay calm. Don't do anything rash. Dad! Lily finally noticed him, her eyes shining in a way that made his heart ache. She started to run to him, but Susan held her by the shoulder. Lily, honey, remember what we talked about? Susan said, her voice sweet, but with a warning tone that didn't go unnoticed. The girl stopped, her face showing a confusion that shouldn't exist in someone so young. Ayla looked from one to the other, her expression revealing that she was beginning to understand the complexity of the situation. What do you want, Susan? John asked, trying to keep his voice controlled. I want everyone to see the truth, she replied, to see how you abandoned your own daughter to play daddy with a stranger. I didn't abandon anyone. John's voice rose, but he quickly controlled himself when he saw Lily flinch. You prevented me from seeing her. You destroyed our family. I protected our daughter, Susan retorted, and now I need to protect her again. Lily, show your father what you brought. With trembling hands, Lily took a folded piece of paper from her backpack. It was a drawing. It showed her, Susan, and Mark all smiling, with the words, "My family," at the top. The blow landed squarely. John felt like all the air had been sucked from his lungs. "See?" Susan continued, her voice now laced with false concern. "Lily already has a new family, a stable family, with the means to give her everything she needs. We don't need your attempts at redemption." It was then that something unexpected happened. Ayla, who had remained silent until then, got up from the piano. With firm steps, she approached Lily and took the drawing from her hands. "Can I see?" she asked gently. Lily nodded, curious about the other girl's attitude. Ayla examined the drawing for a moment, then walked to her school backpack and took out another paper. "Look," she said, showing her own drawing to Lily. "I made one too." It was the drawing that John had found among the sheet music. Her and him, holding hands, with the words, "Best dad in the world, your father." "Our father," Ayla continued, her voice small but firm. "He saved me. He gave me a home when I had nothing. And you know what's most important? He never asked me for anything in return, only love." Susan tried to intervene, but Ayla continued. "When bad people wanted to use me to make money, he said no. When they offered fame and success, he chose my happiness. That's what a real dad does." Lily looked at Ayla's drawing, her eyes shining with suppressed tears. "But Mom said..." "Your mother said a lot of things," Ayla interrupted, with a wisdom beyond her years, "but you need to listen to your heart." At that moment, Mrs. Beatrice, who had observed everything in silence, sat down at the piano. Without saying a word, she began to play a soft melody, the same song that Ayla had sung that first night when she met John. Ayla began to sing, her sweet voice filling the room. It was a song about love, about forgiveness, about family. Lily watched her, mesmerized, until hesitantly she began to sing along. Their voices blended in perfect harmony. Two sisters that fate had separated, but that music united. Susan watched the scene with an expression of pure shock. Her plan to use Lily to destroy John was backfiring. "Enough of this charade," she finally shouted, advancing to grab Lily by the arm. "We're leaving now." But Lily pulled away. "No, Mom, I want to stay a little longer. I want to meet my sister." The words hit everyone like a thunderbolt. Susan recoiled as if she had been slapped, her normally controlled face now a mask of fury. "There is no sister," she exploded. "That girl is nothing to us. She's just a what, Susan?" Dr. Miller's voice cut through the air like a razor. "Be careful what you say, because now we have all the documents that prove Ayla's origins. And more importantly, we have proof of your attempts at judicial manipulation, child exploitation, parental alienation." He paused significantly before continuing. "Do you really want to keep this up? Because I can guarantee that no judge is going to look kindly on a mother who uses her own daughter as a weapon in a personal vendetta." The silence that followed was deafening. Susan looked around like a cornered animal, searching for a way out. But there was nowhere to run. Her own trap had closed upon her. "Lily," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. "Let's go, now." But Lily didn't move. Instead, she took a step towards John, then another, until finally she ran and threw herself into the arms of the father she hadn't seen in so long. "Forgive me," she sobbed, clinging to his neck. "Forgive me for believing the lies." John hugged her tightly, his own tears now flowing freely. Ayla approached timidly, until John extended an arm, bringing her into the embrace as well. There, in that modest living room, to the sound of Mrs. Beatrice's piano, a shattered family began to piece itself back together. Not in the way anyone might have predicted, but in the way that fate had determined. Susan watched the scene with an unreadable expression. Her last card had failed spectacularly, but she still had one last move to make. A secret she had kept for years, and that could change everything again. The moment Susan opened her purse and took out a yellowed envelope, everyone in the room felt the shift in the atmosphere. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of defeat and triumph, that made John squeeze his daughters even tighter against him. "You know, John," she began, her voice strangely calm, "for years I've carried this secret. I thought I'd never need to reveal it, that I could use it as a last resort if necessary. It seems that moment has arrived." Dr. Miller took a step forward, but Susan raised her hand, preventing him from speaking. "No, Doctor. This time you're going to listen to me, because this story started long before anyone here imagines." She opened the envelope with fingers that trembled slightly, taking out an old photograph. In the image, a young woman held a newborn baby. The woman's face was impossibly familiar. "Conceição," whispered John, recognizing Isla's biological mother. "Yes," confirmed Susan. "Conceição da Silva. The same woman who worked in my house for years, long before I met you, John. The same woman who took care of me when I was pregnant, with Lily." Mrs. Beatrice, who had been watching everything in silence, put her hands to her mouth. She was beginning to understand where that revelation would lead. "Conceição was more than just a maid," Susan continued, her voice now filled with an emotion that no one there had ever seen before. "She was my confidant, my friend, the only one who knew my deepest secrets, including—" She paused, looking directly at Lily. "Including that I couldn't have children." The silence that followed was deafening. Lily looked at her mother, then at John, her big eyes full of confusion. "Lily is not my biological daughter," Susan revealed finally. "She is Conceição's daughter." The revelation hit everyone like a bomb. John staggered backward, his legs weakening. Dr. Miller quickly brought him a chair to sit down. "That's impossible," murmured John. "Lily, she has the same eyes as her mother," Susan completed. "The same eyes that Isla has, because they are sisters, John. Blood sisters." Ayla and Lily looked at each other, really looked at each other for the first time. The resemblance, now that they knew, was undeniable. The same expressive eyes, the same face shape, the same natural gift for music. "Conceição was pregnant when she came to work for me," Susan continued. "I had just found out that I couldn't have children. I was devastated. When Lily was born, we made a deal. She would let me raise the girl as my own, in exchange for a better life for her other daughter, who was with relatives." Tears ran down Susan's face now, her mask of coldness finally breaking. "But Conceição got sick, seriously. Before she died, she made me promise that I would take care of Lily, that I would give her everything I could. And I promised. I promised that no one would ever know the truth, that she would always be my daughter." "That's why you married me," said John, understanding hitting him like lightning. "You needed someone with money and influence to make the adoption unquestionable." Susan nodded slowly. "At first, yes. But then I really fell in love with you, John. And when everything fell apart, when you lost everything, I panicked. I was afraid that the truth would come out, that I would lose Lily. So you separated the sisters," concluded Mrs. Beatrice, her voice filled with sadness. "Such different destinies for two girls of the same blood." "And when Isla appeared in the media," continued Dr. Miller, "you recognized the resemblance. You were afraid that someone else would notice. That's why you tried to destroy everything," said John, his voice choked with emotion. "It wasn't about money or revenge. It was about keeping your secret. Lily, who had remained silent until then, took a step towards Susan. "Why, Mom? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" "Because I was afraid of losing your love," replied Susan, tears now flowing freely down her face. "You were everything I had, Lily, everything that kept me human." It was then that Isla did something that no one expected. She gently released herself from John's arms and walked to Susan. Her small fingers touched the face of the woman who had for so long been her adversary. "Our mother must have been very special," she said softly, "to trust her daughters to people she thought could love us." Susan looked at that child she had tried to destroy and saw in her the same goodness that she had once seen in Conceição. She fell to her knees, sobbing, as Isla hugged her. Lily joined the hug, and for a moment, in that room, the past and the present met in a reconciliation that no one could have predicted. Dr. Miller cleared his throat, gently breaking the moment. "We still have a lot to resolve legally. The truth about the girl's origins needs to be officialized." "Yes," agreed Susan, standing up and wiping away her tears. "It's time to do what's right. Lily deserves to know her sister, deserves to have her father back in her life." "And Ayla?" asked John, his heart tight with worry. "Ayla is where she always should have been," replied Susan, a small smile appearing on her lips. "With the father who saved her when everyone else failed her." 10 years had passed since that day. In a packed theater, 2 young women prepared to go on stage. Lily, now a talented pianist, adjusted the bench of the grand piano. Beside her, Isla warmed up her voice, her eyes occasionally searching the front row. There was John, his hair now grey but his eyes shining with pride. Beside him, Susan, no longer the cold and calculating woman of before, but someone who had learned that family goes far beyond blood or documents. Mrs. Beatrice, now an elderly lady, held the hand of Dr. Miller, who had become much more than a lawyer. He was part of that peculiar family that fate had brought together. When the first notes of the piano filled the theater, followed by Isla's crystal-clear voice, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. The music they presented was special, an original composition that told the story of 2 sisters separated by fate but reunited by love. And as he watched his daughters shine on stage, John thought about how life takes turns. He who once had everything and lost everything had found something much more valuable in the end. A true family, built not with money or power, but with love, forgiveness, and redemption. The last note of the music echoed through the theater, followed by an explosion of applause. Lily and Ayla hugged each other, their tears of joy mingling. They were no longer the boss's daughter and the abandoned girl. They were simply sisters, united by a bond that neither time nor distance could break. And in the front row, John cried unashamedly, his heart overflowing with gratitude. That night, when he thought about giving up on everything, had turned into the first chapter of a story much bigger than he could have imagined. A story that proved that sometimes we need to lose everything to find what really matters. A story about how true love can heal even the deepest wounds. A story about a family that fate separated, but that love brought back together.